welcome to the paranormal and metaphysical world of Twilight Tonight. Host Dee Moonflyer grew up with very open-minded parents who had many experiences with UFOs and the paranormal. Because of her mom's insistence on exposing her to spiritual classes, meditation, and teachings of Edgar Cayce, Dee had a fascination and deep interest in the paranormal. Her own paranormal experiences have led her to seek out and interview other fascinating, knowledgeable people for better understanding of this phenomenon. Now, your host of Twilight Tonight, Dee Moonflyer.
Happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to Twilight Tonight. Tonight, as always, I have a most amazing guest, and he has actually been on Twilight Tonic Paranormal podcast. But I am so happy. Author, demonologist, adventurer, historian, paranormal investigator, author of Ghosts and Demons and the Last Things, Ghosts and Demons and the Forgotten, The Truth About the Bell Witch, The Thomas House Truth of the Bell Witch, and The Thomas House Hotel, and more. You can find his books on Amazon. Please welcome Kyl Cobb Jr.
Hi there.
Kyle. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you tonight?
I'm good. You've done out crazy adventures, 60 countries. You have studied demonology, the paranormal. How did the demonology start with you, Kyl?
Well, I didn't know it, but I was actually kind of raised preparing for it. When I was 12/13 years old, I was in middle school, and I had a college professor give up his teaching post at a university and come to teach middle school. He took care of his dying parents. And as part of that, he decided that we were part of the gifted program. He decided that he wasn't going to teach the regular kind of curriculum. He was going to teach his college level curriculum. And he focused on ancient Greek and ancient Greece. And so here I am, 12, 13 years old, reading the Iliad and the Odyssey and exploring Greek plays and the Greek religion. And as part of that, there was the language side of it. There was the Latin. By the time I was a year in, I could read the Ovid in Latin. So, that's just, I was raised in this whole culture where it wasn't mythology, it was religion, it was history. But I'll be honest, I hated it. I hated every moment. But at the same time, it laid a foundation. And years later, right before going away to college, my dad died. And so that kind of put me on a religious quest. And then that was added to because I had another college professor who was my history teacher, and he made it come to life. He would read out of the Medici's diaries every class. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly history was something larger. And so as I explored the religious aspect, I needed to know where it came from. So from a Christianity perspective, I started looking at the different denominations of Christianity and understanding how they differed. And then I said, well, this didn't just happen overnight. What happened before? And so I would go backwards in history, and I would look at the Reformation and then go back further. And you would look at how the Catholic beliefs as the church evolved over the first millennia. And you would, most Christians today wouldn't realize that the Christianity that they get taught in their churches is nothing related to what Christianity was 2,000 years ago. And so much of that for me was a revelation, because I was raised Southern Baptist and eventually converted to Anglican, but you still in most churches, you only get the headlines. And so I pushed back to the beginning of Christianity. And then when I got done with that, I also went back forward a little bit. And I said, well, what are the offshoots? What are the heresies that get denounced? What are grimoires? Which, by the way, grimoires, even though they're these creepy spell books and movies, they're not. Most grimoires are actually Christian prayer books. And don't tell the magic practitioners that. But it's the truth. Most grimoires, once you learn to read the sigils are just a shorthand. Once you learn to read that, you understand that these circles that you see with the pentagrams in them, they actually, almost in every case, 95% of them have the word of God or the name of God as the outer or inner controller of whatever the demon is it's talking about. So you start unraveling that. And then once I got kind of done with Christianity, I went back and studied the Jewish tradition. And then I studied ancient Egyptian and how the Canaanites impacted the Christian ideas and the Jewish ideas. And eventually you go all the way back to Mesopotamia. And you find that's the earliest writing that we have at this point that we can understand. And from there, almost all the ideas of gods and demons and religious practices are kind of based there. And then if you go to where Alexander conquered the world, they were all Hellenized. So the ideas of ancient Mesopotamia got the ideas of the Greeks basically laid on top. If you go the other way, though, they didn't get that same impact. Those ideas were impacted by Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Hindu, eventually the Taoist, and it changed as you went, but the core ideas still were preserved. And then when you jump to North America, old North American ideas of gods and demons match almost exactly with the Mesopotamian. So that's how I went about studying the different religions. And there was no originally paranormal motivation at all. It was, I just want to know what the truth is. I don't care what the truth is, but I want to know what it is.
Right.
So I don't bias myself in going in there. I just let me unpeel the onion to find out what's in the center. So
it was really interesting. From my understanding, you studied 14 demons?
Well, my latest book is 14 named demons, and it also looks at the archetypes for the Eastern cultures as well. And so looking at the named demons, part of the reason that actually happened, that wasn't the original book that was supposed to be created. Forgotten Lore was a book that made itself, because part of what I'm doing, she mentioned I'm a demonologist, or you mentioned I'm a demonologist. I'm not a TV demonologist. I don't get possessed every week. You know, my interest.
I'm happy about that.
Yes. My interest is studying the evolution of the idea, because one culture's demon is another culture's God usually.
Yes.
And so part of what I did is I went back and I said, I would get phone calls all the time. Hey, Kyl, I've got a client saying that, they're getting possessed by this person or this demon. What can you tell me? And I'd be like, well, let me, dig into it. And so I would go back and I would do the hard research and come up and say, okay, they were on Supernatural this week. And, most of the time that's where the possession cases or the demonic cases come from. As you can tell based on the calls, what TV show had a demon guest star, what movie is popular, what Exorcist movie just came out that may have a featured named demon. So you can trace that down. But what I started to do is I focused in, some of the demons are straight out of other cultures. And the reason we think of them as demons is because they were the competing religion. My favorite is, there's one, from a biblical perspective, you've heard of Beelzebub, right? Mm-hmm. But Beelzebub is a corruption of the name. So if you start peeling the onion back, you find out at the time of Jerusalem, when the Jews first got there was a Canaanite god called Hadad. Mm-hmm. And the word Baal is the Canaanite word for Lord. Just like Christians today and Jews don't use the name of God, they use the title, the Lord, our Father, whatever. They inherited that from the Canaanites. So the people of Canaan influenced the religion of modern Christians today, and we don't realize it. But so that Hadad had the title of Baal, and there were lots of gods in that pantheon that were called Baal whatever. But Baal Hadad became so incredibly popular, he actually became the predominant god worshipped throughout the Mediterranean, all the way from Morocco all the way up through Turkey. And so this god was like a leading competitor to the Jewish tradition. When we talk about the tribes of Israel, that's a euphemism to take care of sensibilities of the modern reader. The tribes of Israel really meant the 12 different religions that were worshipped by the Israelis, most of which were not monotheistic. So, you think about, Christianity descended from Judaism. Not really. It descended from what eventually won out as the predominant religion. But that's why, like when Moses goes up to get the 10 Commandments, he comes down and they're worshiping a bull. Well, what's the importance of the bull? Well, the bull is an Egyptian symbol, the Apis bull, but we find out when we dig in, the bull is the symbol of Hadad, and he takes the form of the bull. And so one theory is that the worshipers were worshiping Hadad with the golden calf. So, and then when we look, though, we find out, and this is the part that for me was really a mind-blowing revelation, we find out linguistically, if we take Hadad and we roll him backwards, that the earliest reference, every single language on earth has some form of the word Daios in it. And Daios is the sky, they believe, a sky god. And so Hadad is directly, and his symbol, by the way, Daios symbol was a bull. And if you believe that there's a relationship, just look at modern world today. So the Spanish word Dios is a derivative of that. The Latin word used by the Roman Catholic Church for 2,000 years, Deus. And another little trivia question, or another little trivia note for that you can win in a trivia contest. The head god in the Greek pantheon, if you ask people, they'd say, well, it's Zeus. Well, if you look on Zeus's temple, his name is Deus. The Christians couldn't have their god called the same as the chief Greek god, and so they changed the pronunciation for him. But it's this interconnectivity that just is mind-blowing, and that's what really got me charged. You start seeing it. Baptism, for instance, the idea of water purification. Actually, you find that in the Sumerian exorcism ritual. And I actually dug that up and I republished it because for me it was a revelation. When I first was studying the idea of the demonic stuff, I would hear this, well, the earliest thing is the Sumerian exorcism, but nobody had it.
Right.
And one day I was reading some a Sumerian translation of a tablet from the early 1800s. And I'm going through it, and I've got the Sanskrit, or the cuneiform rather, and I've got the translation for the 1800s, and I'm looking at it going, this sounds really familiar. Mm-hmm. And I get, several thousand words into it, I'm like, I have the real exorcism ritual. Huh. And for me as a history nerd, mind blown. And, to this day, that's still one of the coolest things I've ever research-wise found.
That's right. I would never suspected that. The Catholics are so big on doing that as an infant to wash original sin away. So basically, they're doing an exorcism. The actual Catholic exorcism rite originated as part of the baptism ritual in about the 4th century. And then gradually, as the Catholics solidified their different rituals, it got more and more prominence and was repeated more and more. And it eventually became its own rite. And as they say, the rest is kind of history. When in 1614, it was standardized. And then they revised it in the late 90s, but most Catholic priests won't use the new ritual. Gotcha. I always find it interesting, people that claim to be demonologists or exorcists, especially from what I've read, there's only 12 ones in the United States from the Vatican
Mhm.
studied in the Vatican, and that's it.
Yep.
What is the difference between someone who claims to be an exorcist and the one that studied at the Vatican?
Well, the Vatican now offers a school for exorcism. They actually, my book Forgotten Lore, this is me bragging a little bit. I had a deacon send it to his bishop, who actually sent it to the Vatican for papal endorsement. I got turned down, but because they don't do paranormal. That's where they draw the line.
Right.
But the main difference is these days, the Catholic Church, the true Catholic Church, the Holy See, offers an actual exorcism training course to prepare its priest for it. There's a strict set of standards to when you can do an exorcism and when you can't. The actual true exorcism, what they call the full exorcism, takes about 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes, and you repeat it over and over again. And sometimes you may do it for 12 hours a day with just small periods in between. And this goes back ultimately to the fundamentals of Christianity. I'm going to take a quick aside here. Fundamentally, in the West, we didn't understand the Bible when it was translated. So the Bible came from sources that were Hebrew. And then when the Council of Trent was going through and deciding what went in the Bible, they said, and we'll only include the stuff in the original Greek. Well, Greek was the primary international language throughout the Mediterranean. But that didn't mean that there weren't works that should have been in the New Testament that were not, or that could have been written in Aramaic, or any of the other many languages that crisscrossed that whole region. So as they go through and they're making these decisions, they go and it's translated first. The Bible goes into Greek in a book that, just for English perspective, we'll call the 70. Then it goes into what's called the Vulgate Bible, which is where it's translated into Latin. And the problem was the monks doing the translation could read Greek, but they didn't understand the Greek culture because they were 300 years removed, or actually, strictly speaking, they were about 500 years removed from the high Greek culture. So what happened is they would see words like daemon and demonium, and they didn't know the difference. So they combined the ideas. And just quickly, the difference, or the cultural miss, was the Greeks believed there were 3 levels of divinity. There was the theos, which is like Zeus on Olympus, and the gods when they're on their immortal realm. When they came to Earth, so if Zeus came to Earth to impregnate Leda, he was called a daemon. So Theos on Olympus, daemon on Earth. And then there was and also I can throw in there like things like Achilles, who's a demigod, a half human, half god, or Hercules is a demigod, or even like Medusa and the satyrs and all of that. They're all daemons. Well, then there was a third class called the demonium, which we would kind of think of as almost like a guardian angel. It whispers into your ear, don't do this, it's bad. Intuition is another way to think about it. So when they're going through and translating the Bible into Latin, don't know the difference between a daemon and demonium. A daemon is intangible. A daemonium, a daemon is tangible. A demonium isn't. And what it is, they combine the two, and suddenly all the divinity on earth, mortal and intangible, which means they could be. And the reason I go into this is because that forms a fundamental Catholic belief. So the Catholic exorcism doesn't believe you can kill a demon, doesn't believe you can hurt a demon. It follows the model that Jesus uses, where he casts the demons out of the host and into something else, like the pigs, for instance. And then when he kills the pigs, he's not killing the demons. He's just freeing the demons to go about their way and not be part of that host. So that fundamental belief you couldn't hurt them is where we actually get into the idea. So the term exokizo means to command. So when you're doing an exorcism, you're just commanding the demon to leave. Ekbalo is the Greek term for an actual exorcism where you're actively getting rid of it. So those fundamental differences go into the building of the Catholic mentality on demons, and that becomes part of the later Protestant ideas. And that's where we begin to get into this question you originally asked, what's the difference? Well, the Catholics still have very regimented rules. When is someone possessed? You have to go through, there's 4 tests. Do they have knowledge they shouldn't have? That includes languages that they shouldn't be able to speak. Do they exhibit extraordinary feats of ability that they shouldn't be able to do? So like if an Olympic gymnast does flips, that's nothing. If an old fat man like me does flips, there's something strange going on. So, you know, you have to go through these. You have to also eliminate any kind of mental illness or physical ailment that can cause these symptoms from occurring. And so if you go through these tests, you have less of a chance of making a misdiagnosis. Well, the other exorcist type individuals here in the in the United States in particular, but all over the world, they aren't part of the Roman Catholic Church. They're not part of the Holy See. And they base it on, there's a line in Acts basically where Jesus says, anybody who believes in me and is doing an exorcism in my name should go forth and do it. But that they treat exorcism there like it's a cold from the biblical perspective. So what has happened is there is something called a lesser exorcism, which again, even when the Roman Catholics are doing it, most of the Roman Catholics exorcisms. So if you see someone on a television channel, I got an exorcist involved. Well, the exorcism they do is a minor exorcism, which is nothing but prayers. So that doesn't require the Holy See, the Vatican, to approve it. Your bishop can just say, "Yep, go ahead, sure," and you can do it. So that's part of it. Is you have a lot of the Catholic ones here in the U.S., the true Roman Catholic ones, aren't really full exorcisms. Then you also have spin-off Catholic organizations, or the word Catholic just means whole. So there's not copyrighted, it's not trademarked. So in addition to that group that's not part of the true priest for the Roman Catholic Church, you have that set of folks, but then you also have a lot of the denominations do something called deliverance ceremonies. And again, it's the same thing. If you're a Methodist or a Church of God or Baptist or whatever, you're praying over someone because you believe that there's some evil influence. I will also add that almost more than 99% of the time, if you see someone injured or killed in an exorcism, it's a deliverance ceremony. There are certain fringe groups of Christianity that will beat the evil out of people as part of their deliverance ceremony. So, yeah.
Not good.
I've actually had some ceremonies that I have actually physically walked out of. And it had nothing to do with anything demonic. It had more to do with what was happening in the situation.
Interesting. And then you have the demonologist on TV. Anything that goes bump in the night, it's a demon.
Well, you know, I like to just remind folks that when we're seeing television, it's entertainment. It's not real. You know, the flashy lights are flashy lights because they're good for visuals on TV. And, you know, the idea that any paranormal event, much less a super rare demonic incident, will occur in time for a camera to catch it is, I'm not going to say out of the hundreds of millions of hours of video that get shot from security cameras and television and all that around the world every day, that we don't occasionally catch something paranormal. But the reality is we don't catch it for a television show on demand. And, when you start talking about someone getting possessed on TV, more than likely and I've made this comment publicly quite a few times, they're either off their meds or need to be on their meds, or, they've got another motivation. And one of the most famous cases of exorcism was the movie, if you ever saw the movie Emily Rose, The Exorcism of Emily Rose years back. The real story, it's really based on a girl named Anneliese Michael and little German girl. And there's actually an alternate movie called Requiem in German, which looks at the other side of the story. But the reality is, Anneliese, there was a priest that got a hold of her case. This was right at the time that the Peter Blatty book had come out, The Exorcist, and there was fame and stuff going for that. And this priest wanted that fame. And he would go and he actively encouraged Anneliese that it was a possession. She grew up in a hyper-religious family, and her mother would use religion to punish the children. And Anneliese was, from an early age, she would daily pilgrimage to a church to confess her sins, to the point where the priest told her she didn't need to come in every day because she didn't sin that much. And this is the situation with her got worse. Poor Anneliese, they would do exorcisms, I mentioned before. They're 20 to 30 minutes, right? And in between, they would make her do the prostrating. And that's where you take the sign of the form of a cross, and you go down on your knees and lay down on the floor and say maybe a Hail Mary or whichever prayer the priest wants you to do. And you'll keep doing that over and over again. So in Annaliese's case, she was doing it. She would do a 30-minute exorcism. She would do 30 minutes of that prostration. She would do a 30-minute exorcism. And she did this for 12 or more hours a day, every day. She was also starving herself because the priest told her that she needed to deny herself so she could deny evil. And what eventually happens is Anneliese destroys her knees. And that's why she gets wobbly. Because she can't walk well, she falls and breaks her teeth. So that's why if you ever Google her on the internet, the pictures are horrific. She looks like skin and bones, but it's because she was manipulated into it. It's crushing. I had, when I first put her in, she was in my very first paranormal book. My first paranormal book, The Lost Things, was done like a textbook to answer questions that I didn't know. And after I got done with that, I started doing the research on some of the famous cases, like the truth behind The Exorcist, the truth behind Anneliese. So I got to read Annaliese's, some of her diaries. And I reviewed the court cases. And it's the most horrific, tragic thing. But it's something that says when you're watching television today and you see them talk about, oh, we did an exorcism, it took us 10 minutes.
Wow.
It's complete crap, totally. And, if you don't have a set of clearly defined rules, and that's, I interface with Catholic priests, I interface with preachers, I interface with shaman, with Jamin, anybody who needs help, I'm willing to work with them and their religious sensitivities and culture. But the thing is, when you go into something like an exorcism, you have to have rules. You have to know what you're looking for and how to take care of it. And, I will say, though, at the same time, as you get to, like, Tibetan is a great example, the Tibetan religion, and northern India, too, and Nepal, they used to, 1,000 years ago, they would crucify you on the ground with wooden stakes to get the demons out, grounded. I can't get up and grab it, but I have a fervo back there, which is one of the weapons that they used for 500 years, the metal version of what they would stake people to the ground with. as part of the religious ceremony. But again, it's important that anybody dealing with demonics have a clear set of rules that they follow for the protection of the alleged victim. And, medical opinions are needed, psychiatric, all of those check boxes have to be gone through, because you find out more often than not, most of the historic cases of demonic aren't. They're our lack of understanding of mental illness. And, we like to always think whatever day we live in, we're in the enlightened times. And
Sure.
we're much more enlightened today than we were in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. But someone, 50 years from now is going to say, these people were primitive. They used electricity, we just don't, we have to put it all in perspective. And that's, I know it's a long answer to your short question.
That's okay. Kai, we're going to take a short break from our sponsor and we'll be right back. We're back with Kyl Cobb. Kyl, I have a question for you. I know, like, the Catholic Church and all the other churches have names for demons. Are there actual Lucifer, which from my understanding, Lucifer means enlightened, are part of a word that means lightened one? So that confuses me. Why would they call him Lucifer if it means lighted one?
Well, once upon a time, so this is the reason my forgotten lore got sent all the way up to the Vatican. Lucifer doesn't exist. Lucifer is a typo, literally. He's a translation error. So the origin of Lucifer, the name Lucifer only appears once in the current Christian Bible. That appears in Isaiah 14:12. And what's happening in Isaiah is a prophet, and he's predicting the future. And as part of it, the Jews have been thrown out of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And the king Nebuchadnezzar II, or his son was actually the regent. So we don't know who Isaiah is actually taunting, but it's one of the two. Isaiah is in 14, he's talking about how eventually the Babylonians are going to be broken and they're going to be forced out by God from Jerusalem. And he actually, in that area of the passages, he's saying, and he that is so wise, he that is so mighty, he that is so perfect, he that carries the torch or the light. And then he goes on to say, are going to fall and be defeated. Well, the trick is where he says, he that carries the light, in Hebrew, it's Hallel, and that means a light bearer. When that's translated later on into Greek for the 70, they change that to Heophoros, which means one who carries the light. Heophoros also meant, could be used to refer to the rising of Jupiter. So I'll mention that. Well, again, hundreds of years later, they go and they translate it to Latin, and for the Vulgate, and as they do that, the Latin word for light is lux. The Latin word, when you conjugate it to one who's carrying it, is Lucifer, lowercase l. So again, the Bible's being hand copied from the Latin for, again, hundreds of years, and eventually it's written in uppercase. But almost the entire Bible at that point was written in uppercase. So you don't have a distinction between upper and lowercase in a lot of terms. So around the end of time, which was the first ending of the universe, they thought at the year 1000 that was going to be doomsday. Their Y2K, so that was their Y1K, I guess. During that, they started making, you may be familiar with the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And the idea of Lucifer being a bad guy came out. And they said, well, hey, maybe this reference to Lucifer is related to the Satan or the Hob Satan. Now, in biblical terms, we've heard Satan, that's the bad guy, right? But there's two different terms used in the Bible and in Hebrew. The word Satan means basically God's prosecuting attorney. He's not against God. He is advocating for God to judge the humans. So, for instance, the trials of Job, that's because the Satan, which is, by the way, the Satan, just plain up word Satan, is not a specific individual. It's a term. Literally, it means like the prosecutor or the adversary. So he will, whichever character this is at that time, will say, oh, you should tempt him. You should try something to show that he is truly following it. Well, then we look at the New Testament version of Satan, and it's actually the word Hob Satan, which means the adversary, the individual. But again, it doesn't mean it's the same individual. It just means it's a specific individual, not a generic title.
Wow.
So eventually, around 1000 AD, the idea of Lucifer being the Satan is kind of done. And that's one of the reasons why, if you're reading Dante, you see it kind of gets blurred in Dante. But you also see a totally different Christian church at that point, right? You have the idea of heaven, hell, and purgatorio. And so you don't die, even if you're a good and virtuous person, unless you're a saint, you don't go to heaven immediately. You go to purgatory to work your sins off. And then once you've done that, you go to heaven. So the Catholic Church and the Christian church evolves. Well, Lucifer becomes a character in it, but not necessarily a bad guy. Even then, in the 1200s and 1300s, there are bishops named Lucifer. There are, because the idea is he was equated to an angel. So that doesn't translate into the super villain we see today. When the split happened, the Martin Luther nailing the thesis and the Reformation began, Luther and Calvin could read Hebrew, is my understanding. So they actually looked at Isaiah and said, there's no guy named Lucifer in here. Lucifer doesn't exist. So for 400 years, Lucifer disappeared again everywhere except as a minor character, kind of off the sides in Catholic religion. Then during that same time period, English version of the Bible became popular, the King James Version, and eventually it came to America as the de facto word of God, that, absolute truth.
Sure.
Well, in 1909, the Sanford Concordance Bible was published. And what was cool about this Bible, or different, for the first time in 400 years, it had margin notes, or we think of them almost like footnotes. But if you'll pick up a King James Bible today, you'll see a lot of them have the margin notes still in them. Well, this Bible actually says in Isaiah 14:12, this reference to Lucifer is clearly talking about the fallen angel, and it says it's Satan. And so suddenly Lucifer becomes a character again. And the thing about this Bible is it became the most highly published version of any Bible in all the world. So as an English Bible, up until roughly the 90s, almost 100% of the Bibles were based a reprinting of this Concordance Bible. And when it went public domain in the 50s, it was retroactively translated into all the world's religions, language, or all the world's languages. And so we then contaminated the Christian belief throughout the planet.
So demons are bad spirits. They're parasites.
That's one belief. The thing is, first of all, the real demonic events are few and far between. Most of the named demons that we find referenced in the Bible, like I said, they're competing religions. They're the guys down the street. But having said that, there are things out there, and they don't seem to play by the rules. They don't seem to be. Here's where I get myself into trouble. You know, the exorcism, the prayers, and things like that don't really seem to be what's eventually causing them, if they leave, to leave. I think I describe them more like mosquitoes. They aren't. It's not like Supernatural TV show. They don't turn into clouds and slide into a meat suit. The real underpinning, when you start peeling back the language of the idea of what a demon is and possesses, they're suggesting thoughts to folks. And it's only over the last 100 years, thanks to popular television and misconception, that we've got the idea that they're sliding into the human bodies. But the idea is, in my limited understanding anyway, is they're like a mosquito in that they feed a little bit and then go to the next person and then go to the next person and go to the next person. And what an exorcism really is, whether it's Catholic or a shaman doing it or a Tibetan monk doing it, is they're swatting at the mosquito. They're saying, hey, we know you're there, leave. And, you don't with demonic cases, contrary to television and the movies, you don't get bleeding walls. You don't get, generally speaking, objects thrown, because just like a mosquito, if it's quiet and not noticed, it can feed and get what it needs and then come back again if it's really lucky. So there's no incentive for demonic type beings to do all the crazy stuff you see in the movies. Most of the time, I tell people, when there's a demonic case, first of all, people are usually off their meds. There's some psychiatric thing going on. They're trying to get attention for TV or fame or something. But then after you weed all those out, there's a small percentage that there is something really going on. And even then, most of that would fall in the category of just a malevolent, straight up paranormal entity. It's not, if it's I don't like to use the term ghost, because one of the things is there's a whole debate that I follow where spirits and apparitions and things like that may not be dead people. That's a whole other tangent. If people want to check it, there's something called M theory, which is a physics theory, which requires infinite parallel universes. And so the short version of the theory is, what we think is paranormal are our universes just bumping together like two balloons.
Interesting.
Our realities.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah.
So the idea is that, if you start whittling them out, you say, okay, here are the crazy people, here's the real paranormal, and then that, as you start kind of slicing it, you realize that the true demonic cases are incredibly rare. And so the idea that you would see someone on television on a weekly basis possessing a host just can't happen.
Right.
The idea that even some of these cases that are very, very famous are real possessions, again, most of them aren't. There's only one out of really all of the famous historical cases that the Catholic Church investigated that has, I think, historical credibility. There's a little African girl, her name is, and I always slaughter it, I think the African pronunciation is Sieli. Little girl in South Africa. At 16, she claimed that she made a pact with the devil. And after that point, there started to be incidents where animals would continually inundate the orphanage she was in. And there were some other things that got the priest concerned enough that he got on a boat, one of the two priests at the orphanage, he got on a boat and went to the Vatican. And so it's a week-long trip by boat. He meets with the authorities there. he comes back, and this was in the late 1800s or early 1900s. He comes back, and this little African girl who barely spoke anything other than the African native language tells the priest in Latin where he went, who he met with, and what he did while he was in Rome. And, that in and of itself, hey, that's a checkbox knowledge that they shouldn't have in a language she shouldn't speak. But what makes this case, of all the cases that are part of the historical record, what makes this case more legit, they go and the priest has been authorized to perform a full exorcism. And again, contrary to the movies, you don't do exorcisms usually in the house. You do it in a church because you do it on holy ground, and according to Catholic tradition. Well, they're doing it in the chapel of the school as part of the orphanage. There are 200 plus witnesses, schoolgirls, that are there praying and all of that. And they all assert with their signatures and their names before God that they see CLD hover 8 feet above the ground during the exorcism. And just as a historical record, that many witnesses gives it some credibility, but a lot of them don't. So,
right.
Anyway,
You also were talking about The Conjuring earlier, the third movie. Could you tell us a little bit about that? This is fascinating.
Again, you're getting me into deep trouble with all their fans. But all right, so once upon a time, there was a man named Gerald Brittle, and he is a writer, a pretty good writer. There were also these two radio show hosts, you may have heard of them, called the Warrens. And the Warrens were doing a supernatural radio show. And there was a little case that you probably, again, have heard of called the Amityville Horror. Well, Brittle and the Warrens got together, and he eventually wrote books like The Demonologist on their behalf, and he worked behind the scenes on a lot of their books. Well, as it turns out, the movies were made, the Conjuring movie and the Conjuring 2, and then eventually Conjuring 3. And as part of it, they eventually, Brittle said, hey, I need to be getting paid. I have a contract that gives me derivative rights to any of the things produced off any of the Warren books. So what eventually begins to happen is he files this lawsuit, and it goes from a couple million to eventually it reaches $1 billion with a B. The movie company, it was New Line that did it on behalf of Warner Brothers, is so desperate. At one point back in the time that this was happening, it's middle 2000s, early 2000s, they offered $2 million to anyone who could prove paranormal existed. Never happened. One of the things that came out is I started looking at the Warrens cases, and this was before Conjuring 3 came out. David Glatzel, who was the little boy, or Glatzel, who's a little boy who is supposedly possessed at the beginning of the Conjuring 3, and that the Warrens pray it out, and the demon leaves and goes into Arnie Johnson. Well, David, when he turned 18, said, hey, I was a minor. I couldn't give anyone legal permission to use my name in the book. And so he tried to stop the books from being produced. So the Devil in Connecticut. And then what eventually happened as part of that, he published a website, and it's now been frozen in time. I think it's even still out there, where he went through and he detailed everything. The Warrens coached him on how to be possessed. And, he talks about this. He talks about he actually had severe mental illness at the time. And he eventually got counseling for the mental illness, and that's what helped solve the situation. And, for me, that was, again, another revelation, because at that time, all the details for the court case with the Warrens hadn't come out yet. But, the fascinating thing was, as they went through this, how did the lawsuit end? Well, the lawsuit ended with a settlement of $900 million getting paid out to Mr. Brittle. No fault. He goes, oh, it was a mistake. We clearly will settle. But the question is, well, why did New Line settle for $900 million? It turns out, as part of the discovery phase, and we know this because Brittle was being funded by someone else to help take care of court cost, the attorneys for Brittle walked in with hand truck after hand truck of boxes. And they had all the notes, the notebooks, where he and the Warrens sat around a table and made up all the stories from the Warrens books. And you said, well, you could fake that. He also had the reel-to-reel tapes of the events. So the movie, the defense that New Line and Warner Brothers should use prior to that point was, well, it's historical fact. We don't have to pay this guy. Well, thanks to Brittle preserving his notes and his audio, it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt that it was all made up. They took little minor paranormal events and they puffed them up to make it entertaining, originally for the radio show, and then eventually they got a movie deal from it and got another movie deal, and that kind of thing. It's one of those things. Poor David, kind of lived in. Because the story behind The Conjuring, Artie kills his girlfriend at the times, the guy she was working for, and so for poor David Glatzel, he kind of lived in the shadows. He tried to keep avoiding it. He didn't want the book published. There were all of these things. He actually is he's a contractor now. He does construction and things like that. He owns a company. But yeah, it's all, I'm not going to say it's a ploy for money. I think the Warrens honestly believed that they were doing some of the right things. I think they just got caught up in their own hype. And at some point, when you've talked about things on the air for 5 or 6 years, it's hard to backtrack and say, oh, we were just joking about that. And it's kind of sad because, like I said, I believe that they did believe that they were devoted. Even the Warrens, though, I mentioned earlier the idea of a deliverance ceremony. That was the kind of exorcisms they performed. They did not perform true exorcisms from a Roman Catholic perspective. And they even admitted that in some of their writings and some of their discussions. So
interesting. So what is next for you? You've done so much research and so much historical stuff. What is next on your plate?
The next project is a project totally of passion and love and obsession. So I was writing. I got it. I can actually pimp it. About 2012 or so, I was doing a paranormal investigation in my little hometown south of Atlanta, Griffin, Georgia. And as part of it, anytime I do a paranormal investigation, I do research on the history. And so I dug in and started doing a little research on my history of my hometown. And it was all a lie. Everything about it. It was all fabricated. So I'm not real popular. But I ended up, as part of that, my small town newspaper wasn't digitized at the time, but a neighboring newspaper about 200 miles away reported on my hometown all the time, because my hometown was the major center of rural Georgia at the time. And there was a paragraph that said a Griffin debutante had her fortune stolen by a con man. And so that sparked me on this worldwide quest to find out about this con man. And it turned out this guy at the time, when I first was digging into it, he was allegedly married to as many as 18 women concurrently. He would go into a town, he would seduce them, only the rich women, he would seduce them, marry them, steal all their money, and leave. And this happened all across the United States. This started in the 1870s, so communication wasn't what it was. He was a great talker. He had a near photographic memory, if not a photographic memory. He was. They wanted to make him the first U.S. senator to the North Dakota. They put him on a congressional campaign to run for Congress in Virginia. He was on 2 presidents' campaigns as their leading stump speaker around the U.S. So this guy was smooth. And eventually he goes to New York. He seduces the wife of a Christian Science magazine there, the International Magazine of Christian Science. He seduces her. She kicks her husband out. They do a pseudo Christian Science divorce and marriage at the same time. And that's all okay until he publishes an article saying that he is the love God, because no man alive knows women better than he does, having been married to 8 concurrent women. He admits to that. Eventually, he gets driven out of New York, and he goes to New Zealand. He founds a cult in New Zealand.
Of course.
Maybe a sex cult, because there's some strange stuff going on. It eventually has as many as 40,000 followers. They built him a temple in the middle of Christchurch, New Zealand, and they built him a palace next to it as his palatial home. They built a social hall and kindergarten for him. And it is such a powerful organization that it threatens to put the Christian churches out of business in New Zealand. And they, from time to time, different individuals will dig up the information that he's a con man from America. He talks his way out of it. Not a big deal. And so this guy's just amazing. He eventually marries another woman, gets rid of the wife he took with him to New Zealand, marries another woman. They flee New Zealand to Australia. They get invited back to New Zealand, so he goes back for a little while, for a couple of years. Then he goes to Australia. He makes the mistake of, to get money again, he tries to seduce an older woman again. And she becomes so love-struck that, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned.
Right.
And when he moves away to actually become a preacher, or a priest rather, at a church in Sydney, he gets, he's becoming super popular. She ends up pressing charges for him for fraud. So he's arrested and sentenced to life in prison. The judge says he's the most dangerous man who's ever crossed his bench and the most dangerous man in Australia. 7 years later, he talks his way out, and he then convinces a preacher visiting, a Methodist preacher visiting Australia, that he and his wife have been shipwrecked, gets that preacher to pay for him and his family to go back to America. He's killed along the way when his boat sinks, but he gets better. And then he eventually reaches the United States, convinces the Methodist Church that he is one of their priests, never has been, and they give him a parish in New York. And
Wow. What is that book called?
This is actually going to be a 3-book series. So this book is called The Love God Revealed. There is, and this is already like 460 pages. This is straight up history. There's one called The Love God Speaks. And what I did with that is as part of this cult, he paid to have a stenographer transcribe his sermons.
Kyl,
we're
out of time.
That's
why it's so interesting. Kyl, you get his books on Amazon, everybody. Kyl, you're amazing. It's such a joy to talk to.
It's a lot of fun. Thank you.
I hope you come back on sometime, talk more about the love God and the haunting.
Anytime.
Have a good evening. Thank you so much, Kyl, and hopefully we'll cross paths soon.
Absolutely. Cheers to everyone.
Bye.
The truth is here and now on WLTK-DB Talk Radio at WLTK-DB.com.